I'm David Morris. I'm the Principal Lawyer at the Environmental Defender's Office in the Northern Territory. A mining company, once it's been given an exploration permit to mine for petroleum in the Northern Territory, has a rather remarkable number of entitlements under that exploration permit. A mining company is entitled to go onto the land that is the subject of that permit and do essentially whatever's necessary and convenient for them to allow that exploration to occur. Now, what that means in a practical sense is that they're able to go onto land at a time that is reasonable and convenient to them. So that may not be at a time that's reasonable or convenient to the landowner or the people who are occupying that land, but a time that is reasonable and convenient to the mining company. They're also entitled to bring onto the land any equipment that they might need to use, and that might require large lights, it might require large vehicles, and they might even need to construct a road onto that property, which they are entitled to do. They are also, somewhat surprisingly, entitled to take and use as much water as they need for the activities under that exploration permit. A really extraordinary right that they can go onto a piece of land which they don't own and take all of the water that they need for the fracking of a well, which is what often occurs in terms of exploration for oil and gas within the territory. An exploration permit might sound like a relatively minor and preliminary step, but in terms of fracking, it affords a mining company an extraordinary and large number of entitlements and rights over that piece of land. Fracking is a rather unique process in the Territory in terms of the way it's regulated. Unlike other forms of mining, the rights of community members, community groups, NGOs, concerned citizens are very restricted in terms of fracking. So they can't, for example, object or make submissions in relation to fracking unless a person is an owner of the land on which that fracking is intended to occur, or the owner of land adjacent to that. The rights of people to object and make submissions, which must be considered by the minister, are very, very tightly restricted in terms of fracking. That's problematic because it denies a voice to a large proportion of the community in terms of fracking. In reality, there is very little scope for the appeal of the minister's decision, and in the event he makes a bad decision, there's very little scope for the community to challenge that in a court. There's no right under Northern Territory petroleum legislation for a merits review, and what that means is basically taking the decision of the minister to a court or tribunal to say, well, was this a good decision or not? It's different from what we would call judicial review, which requires the identification and a court finding that the minister had made an error of law. In many cases, the minister may have not made an error of law in that he didn't take into account anything he shouldn't, but just made a bad decision. But we don't have the chance to challenge that in the Northern Territory, and that's disappointing. And I think it's really denying the community in the Northern Territory rights which they should be entitled. The other thing to mention in terms of rights before this process starts is in terms of Aboriginal land. Indigenous traditional owners are entitled under the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act, which is a Commonwealth piece of legislation, to say no to fracking on their land. That right is available to them prior to the granting of an exploration permit. At the very earliest stage, where the least is known about what a mining operation would look like on their land, whether it would be 3 wells or 3,000 wells, they have to decide whether or not they should allow this process to occur on their land. It's a huge burden on an Aboriginal community, and really what we need to do in terms of ensuring that that burden isn't unfair and unreasonable on them is to ensure that free and prior informed consent should occur. And that means looking at working with them, providing them with significant interaction with the different groups of people, providing significant information to them so that they are informed. And the Human Rights Commission has some publications about consultation with Indigenous communities, and that's clearly something which should be provided for in terms of consultation on Aboriginal land. Water is obviously a very precious resource. That's certainly true in the Northern Territory. We have somewhat extreme wet seasons, so there might be a tendency to think that water isn't important, but in actual reality, we have a large and lengthy dry season, and often there are ecosystems that rely entirely on the health of groundwater aquifers. What's unique and I think appalling in the Territory is the fact that mining of any kind is not regulated by the Water Act. Water entitlements in the Territory are generally granted under an 80-20 rule, which means that 20% of the water resources from a particular aquifer or groundwater source are allocated to a beneficial use. Now, beneficial uses include all sorts of things, but include domestic use, stock use, agriculture, horticulture. They can also include industry. But the Water Act, which regulates those entitlements to water, excludes mining activities, which is plainly just an irresponsible way to manage water in the Northern Territory, and one can only assume, if full allocations of that 20% are given to other beneficial uses, that any use of water for mining, and particularly fracking, must be being drawn on the environmental water sources which are required to sustain groundwater-reliant ecosystems.